Imagine waking up on your own land, coffee steaming in your hand, and, watching your HOA president smugly wave down the police to shut your family vineyard because your fence ain't aesthetic enough. What would you do if your HOA tried to bulldoze 3 generations of sweat and soil just to juice someone's property values? Dawn in Suncrest Valley looks like God pulled a linen sheet of silver fog across the hills. Vines stretch in neat green ribs, the kind my granddad planted when vinyl records were still new. I was out there, just past 5 in the morning, pruning shears warm from my palm, when sirens began to wail from way down the county road and roll up the valley like thunder with a badge. Boots crunched over last season's leaves. Radios crackled. And there she stood at my gate, Karen. There's always a Karen. Right blazer, sharp enough to cut glass. White SUV, idling like a watchful shark. Phone tilted just so, to film what she figured would be my public humiliation. I could smell her perfume mixing with the vineyard, earth and oak, and money. Morning, I said, and took a slow sip. Beautiful day for grapes. Karen smiled, the way a cat smiles at a goldfish. Behind her, 2 officers approached like they'd rather be anywhere else. She lifted her chin. Mark Ridgway, she said, crisp as a gavel. You are in clear violation of our community's aesthetic standards. She gestured toward my new fence like it was a weapon. And your business activities? I glanced at the fence, tall, honest, agricultural mesh that keeps deer out and kids from wandering in after dark. The kind you put up when you work a real farm instead of, curating a backyard. Ma'am, I said, still polite. This farm was here before the cul-de-sacs. Way before. She flicked a manicured hand. Suncrest Meadows is a residential community now. We have standards. That word residential landed like a sneer. Like my family's rows of vines weren't a home in their own right. Like the soil should apologize for existing. The officers did what they had to check permits. Ask questions. Write down my answers. They were decent men. Professional. I showed them the papers. They nodded the nod that says, we know this is dumb, but we gotta do it. In the end, they left with handshakes. Not handcuffs. Karen, though, she left with a little smirk, like the first domino had tipped. And, she was kinda right. A certified letter arrived 2 days later. The kind thick enough to bruise your pride. Cease and desist. Words that make small-town bankers sit up straight. According to the letter, my vineyard, my family's life, was an unauthorized commercial operation in a residential environment. Daily fines. Threats to inform my lender. Copies to the county. Copies to the local paper. Copies to anybody who might squint at me sideways at the farmer's market. Most folks forget I used to be a corporate lawyer. San Francisco high-rise. Suits that cost too much. Billing that made people gulp. I kept my name polished, and my conscience, well, let's just say it took a beating until the day my marriage did. 2. When the dust settled, I had a beat-up pickup, a busted heart, and the deed to my granddad's acreage, the one he called the spine of our family. I traded conference rooms for coveralls and found out tractors can be a kind of therapy. So I sat at my kitchen table that night, old pine. Coffee rings like constellations, and spread those papers out. Then, I opened the other box I carried out of that San Francisco office when I walked. The one with muscle memory in it. Real estate law. Land use. All the little knives developers like to hide behind polite smiles. Karen thought she'd bury me in paper. Lady. I spent 15 years learning to dig. I hunted up Granddad's file cabinet in the barn. The one that squeaks like a barn owl when you pull it open. Dust thick enough to sign your name in. Receipts. Maps. Letters. With stamps and colors nobody uses anymore. And tucked in a manila folder marked something like, "Important, keep forever." I found a copy of the original deed, 1962, and a line of language that was worth more than any bottle I'll ever cork. Perpetual farming rights. That's the phrase. Legal bedrock in plain clothes. It means when the county blessed this place as a working farm back when gas was cheap and neighbors waved with all their fingers. It granted protections that later paper pushers can't just wish away because law and fashion changed. HOA bylaws can polish a mailbox, but they can't outrank a deed like that. I drafted a reply letter so clean my old law mentor would have framed it. Attached copies. Explained the agricultural exemption like I was teaching a Sunday school lesson. Sent it certified to everyone Karen had looped in county. Bank. Paper. Then I went back to pruning. And, sorry, tried not to think about lawyers on retainer who bill in 6-minute increments. A county inspector named Rodriguez dropped by a few afternoons later. Good guy. Clipboard. Apology in his eyes. Anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures. He said. I could almost hear Karen's keyboard clacking. We walked the place. The old barn, 1965. Grandfathered and proud. The equipment shed built to code in the late 1990s. All bolts and bracing like a Boy Scout handbook. Even the root cellar. Cooler than a deacon's handshake in July. Rodriguez signed off on everything like a man glad to write something true. Your exemption's rock solid, he said. Somebody doesn't understand rural zoning. I understood just fine. This wasn't about fences. This was about leverage. Suncrest Meadows. Karen's kingdom sprouted 3 years back like a beige rash across the valley floor. She runs the HOA board like a tiny courthouse with worse coffee. And her husband, Preston, flips dirt for a living. Real estate developer. Smile, like a catalog. Hands never quite dirty. There's a certain math to his trade. Buy farmland cheap. Rezone it. Pave it. Sell it. Repeat. The kind of math that turns harvests into cul-de-sacs and, you know, drains the soul right out of a place. I spent an evening with public records and a pot of coffee strong enough to shine boots. Turns out Preston had been busy. 3 developments finished. 2 queued up like planes on a runway. And quiet offers floating around to farm families who'd been here since before color television. You don't have to be a math whiz to see the pitch sell your land now. Or we'll make you sorry. Call me stubborn. Or call me the wrong guy to push. I rang up my friend Jake, environmental attorney. Voice like gravel. Heart like a rescue dog. Buddy. He laughed when I laid it out. She poked a sleeping bear. Didn't she? We made a plan, document everything. Dot every I. Pray for good weather and sane people. Sane people were in short supply. Inside a week, Karen announced an emergency HOA meeting about community beautification and agricultural eyesores that impact property values. That last phrase stung like a hornet. My granddad used to say property values go up and down. Dignity should stay put. I went. The community center smelled like carpet cleaner and anxiety. Maybe 30 homeowners sat in folding chairs, looking like they had chores at home they'd rather be doing. Karen held court up front with a slideshow about neighborhood character. Photos of my tractors from angles so dramatic they could have been crime scene evidence. She passed around a petition loaded with weasel words about safety and traffic and the unspoken sin of not fitting the brochure. Then a miracle. Mrs. Patterson, retired teacher, spine like a steel rod and a cardigan older than me, stood up. "The Ridgeway land fed this valley before half of you were born," she said. "We moved here because of these hills, not in spite of them." There were nods. Quiet ones. Nervous ones. Even a few sighs of relief. Karen's smile cracked a hair. She tabled the beautification vote. Said the board would be pursuing further legal counsel. And I caught her whispering to a stranger in a suit that screamed high hourly rate. When she noticed me watching, she snapped her briefcase shut like a mousetrap. That's when her campaign turned from paper to poison. A Facebook group popped up, Concerned Neighbors of Suncrest. The admin, a profile with Karen's headshot in it like a campaign poster. She posted photos of trucks that delivered my supplies. Called them speeding hazards. Wrote about flies from agricultural waste. Like grapes were biohazards. Shared links to articles about farms in other places that had nothing to do with us. The comments filled with tight smiles and coded phrases about the look of the neighborhood. Neighbors stopped waving. The hardware store guy. Bill used to talk weather and baseball with me until closing time went colder than a February sidewalk. At the bank. Janet, who'd handled my granddad's loans for decades, suddenly needed additional documentation for a routine equipment note. She wore a smile so fake, it squeaked. I ain't bitter. But I noticed. So I dug deeper. Survey lines can be tricky. People assume fences equal boundaries. But old deeds hold secrets. I hired a surveyor who knew how to hear what the land was saying. He came back with news that made me laugh. Right there in my kitchen, our property line ran 50 feet farther east than anyone thought. Right under 3 of the HOA's back fences. Granddad had granted construction easements way back when, but kept title to the dirt. Smart old farmer trick. Never sell the earth. Lease the privilege to use it. Buried in the records. We also found a utility easement conga line running the length of the valley roads. Power. Water access paths that can't be blocked by a board with matching polos. It meant, what I already felt in my bones, this farm wasn't a guest in Suncrest Meadows. Suncrest Meadows was a guest on my farm. Karen either sensed the shift or smelled it on the wind. She called a community safety meeting. The flyers talked fire hazards. Drunk drivers from wine tastings. Mysterious chemical smells. People showed up with tight lips and crossed arms. The signatures on her petitions looked eerily similar. Like one person had signed for dozens of neighbors. I ain't a handwriting expert. But come on. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't exhausting. Then, a thick envelope thudded onto my porch with the kind of weight that makes your stomach drop. A cease and desist letter from a fancy firm with a name like a law school fraternity, Caldwell. Mercer and Associates. Demand shut down all commercial activities within 72 hours. Allegations, a dozen municipal violations ranging from noise to traffic to illegal use in a residential environment. It read like a novel, where every plot point is wrong, but the author spent a lot on adjectives. I took a long walk among the vines and tried to breathe. Lawyers that pricey bleed you by the hour. That's the whole play. Make you pick between bankruptcy and surrender. Then, a voice inside me, half my granddad, half the busted-up lawyer I used to be, spoke plain. You either fight, or you watch them pave the last good thing you own. So I fought. I spent an evening at the county building reading dusty binders beneath humming fluorescent lights. The clerk, Ethel, sharp as a tack, sweet as cinnamon, watched me copy parcel numbers until her break. Honey, she said. What are you chasing? I told her. She disappeared into a back room and came out with a folder that looked like it had survived a flood and a divorce. Historic Agricultural District designation. Filed in the late 1980s. Misplaced ever since. It said, in the kind of language only a lawyer can love, that our valley's heritage farms carried protections that required environmental studies before new development got so much as a shovel. Not a suggestion. A guardrail with teeth. You could almost hear Preston's plans grinding down to sparks. We cross-checked development permits against what the state required. And the gaps were, yikes. A whole neighborhood built without the impact studies that law demanded. Buyers thought they bought houses. On paper, a lot of them might have bought headaches. From where I sat, it didn't smell like oversight. It smelled like somebody had known the rules and hopped the fence anyway. Jake nearly choked, laughing when I called. Mark, he said, this isn't just harassment anymore. This is a pattern. Wire fraud. Maybe. Mail fraud. Conspiracy. He said the quiet part out loud. You might be looking at Rico. While he worked filings, I turned my place into a little evidence factory. Cameras on the fence line. Logs of every call. Every anonymous complaint. When vandals sliced my irrigation one pre-dawn morning, my cameras saw enough to make a detective nod. When a trio of wedding clients got spooked by anonymous calls claiming my wine was contaminated, we pulled phone records and filed affidavits. Fake reviews popped up online, creative enough to win fiction awards, and we captured those, too. The pattern stopped being a hunch and started being a map. Miguel, Father Miguel from St. Agnes, the priest who organizes like a union boss and prays like a thunderstorm, joined our little war room. He knew every farm, family, and every story about land lost under pressure. He brought tamales to meetings in my barn, and a righteous anger that tasted like hope. Brother, he said, we fight for all of them. Dr. Sarah Bennett, soil scientist. Sleeves rolled. Hair in a practical knot. Took samples at dawn and dusk, and put together an environmental picture that looked, honestly, like a crime scene. Improper grading here. Runoff there. Wildlife corridors, severed like a bad haircut. The kind of stuff people call progress until their wells turn funky. The community started to split down the middle like a log left in the sun. Farmers stood with us. Some HOA folks peeled away from Karen's side quietly. Like folks sneaking out of a bad movie. 3 board members resigned in 1 week, citing ethical concerns. Translation: they didn't sign up to be extras in somebody's fraud case. Preston's money problems leaked like a cracked barrel. Construction loans overdue. Vendors suddenly wanting cash. Crews walking off because checks bounced. The man showed up at my gate one foggy morning with a briefcase and a voice full of sunshine on credit. We can make this all go away, he said. A generous purchase. A fresh start. He named a number that would make a normal person sit down. I told him he could keep his number, his briefcase, and the hollow little smile they wrote in on. He lost his temper, said things men regret into microphones, because, yeah, I was wearing one. Agent Rodriguez, turns out he wore 2 hats, had asked me to. Recordings help good people tell the truth in rooms where the truth usually gets drowned. Karen's posts got wilder. Conspiracy stuff. Claims the taxman was coming for me. That inspectors had found chemicals in my barrels. That outsiders were stirring up trouble. You could feel the wheels coming off her story in real time. Even her diehards started unfollowing. Jake made a move that felt like bait on a hook. He asked for a community mediation at the town hall. Neutral ground. Promised to be calm. Karen loved the optics. She'd stroll in, looking righteous. Preston would play the benefactor. I'd look tired and beaten. The news would take a nice Heidi clip, and the board would ride the good press back to their cul-de-sac thrones. But Jake had a different plan. We prepped like it was the big game. Sarah printed charts so clear a 5th grader could spot the violations. Miguel lined up families to testify about the late-night calls and the slow, steady pressure to sell. Ethel polished her reading glasses and stuck that misfiled designation in a fresh folder with tabs like bookmarks of doom. The town hall filled up until people were standing along the walls. Channel 7 rolled a camera into the back. Their reporter, smelling a story so hot it could melt vinyl siding. The mediator. Judge. Wells' calm eyes. Voice, like a Sunday afternoon, called us to order. Karen went first. Oh. The performance. She talked about community standards until the phrase lost all meaning. Waved a stack of signatures that looked photocopied to anyone who'd ever held a pen. Told the room that one man's selfish business was making families feel unsafe. Her smile never touched her eyes. Preston followed, wearing contrition like a rental suit. He offered to purchase my property for fair market value, which was cute, because farms like mine don't have a fair market value. They have history, sweat, funerals, birthdays, and sunset dinners in the rows. He dressed it up as compromise for the greater good. I think I heard a few folks gag softly. Then I stood. I thanked everyone for coming, especially the neighbors who'd been brave enough to show their faces in the same room as the truth. I told a short story about my granddad and the first vine he planted. I held up the 1962 deed with the magic words. I held up the 1987 heritage designation Ethel had rescued from the wrong drawer. I held up the survey map that ran 50 feet under 3 neat backyards. I held up Sarah's charts like a science fair that could send men to prison. I said we'd turned everything over to the state attorney general. I said federal investigators had been asking good questions. I said this wasn't about fences, or tractors, or the sound of a harvest. Morning it was about a coordinated scheme to squeeze farms for profit by bending rules until they snapped. The air in that room changed. You could feel it, like a storm finally breaking. Karen stood up to shout that I was a liar, that I was making it all up for sympathy, that the media was helping me smear good people. But when Agent Rodriguez and 2 marshals walked in through the back doors, all clean and official, something in her voice cracked like old paint. I didn't grin. I ain't that petty. But I did take a full breath for the first time in months. The funny thing about truth is that once it starts spilling, it finds all the cracks. I woke the next morning to a valley buzzing like harvest. Not with bees, but but with phones. Channel 7 ran the story before sunrise. Heritage Farms versus HOA fraud probes in Suncrest. The paper followed with a headline that made Karen's followers choke on their iced lattes. The county posted a notice about reviewing permits. Buyers in Suncrest Meadows started calling their title companies, and then their lawyers, and then, well, one another. My tasting room turned into a command center. Sarah set up a map and poked little flag pins anywhere runoff readings spiked. Miguel made coffee that could raise the dead and ushered people to seats like a maitre d'. Ethel, bless her, brought a box of neatly labeled copies, the little librarian inside her, giddy to watch justice keep its appointments. The first dominoes to fall weren't glamorous. They were paperwork. Temporary injunctions filed. Stop work orders posted. A freeze on new connections to water lines until the environmental review could be done correctly. Which meant the cul-de-sac at the far end of Suncrest went dark at dinner and quieted faster than a nursery after bedtime. Karen tried a Hail Mary livestream in front of the HOA clubhouse with a ring light and what I swear was a teleprompter app. "We're the victims," she said. Eyes glassy. Voice pitched just a hair too high. A coordinated attack on property rights. She kept saying the truth will come out. Which is a brave choice when the truth is walking up your driveway with a badge. Some neighbors wrote me letters. Real ones on paper. Not emails. I didn't know. One said in a tidy hand. Another, "We moved here for the scenery. We didn't mean to be the bulldozers." Bill from the hardware store slipped a 20% discount card into my palm and said, "Sorry, Mark," without looking me in the eye. He wasn't my villain. He was a man who didn't want to pick sides until the ground under him started to move. Karen had no such humility. She doubled down with a glossy mailer sent to every box in Suncrest Meadows, calling me a malicious agitator backed by outside interests. Lady. The only outside interest backing me is the rain. You know what actually quieted the valley? The Sunday sermon. Miguel stepped into his pulpit and told the story of a vineyard owner who built a hedge, dug a press, and leased it to tenants who stopped honoring the land. He talked about false shepherds, and the sin of pretending convenience is the same as good. He said, "Stewardship means speaking up even when it's awkward at the cookout." Folks cried in pews. I ain't ashamed to admit I was one of them. Meanwhile, Jake found suspicious payments in the HOA books, consulting fees, to companies with names like Premier Community Services and Caldwell Residential Solutions that, when you followed the trail, looped right back to Preston Sphere. If you ever want to see a lawyer smile, put the word embezzlement in a sentence with traceable. Our Little Farmers Alliance grew into something with a name and a mission. We met under the old barn rafters with potluck casseroles that could stop a heart in the right way. We shared what we knew, which inspectors were honest, which papers to file, which phrases to use in letters that make powerful people sit up straight. The vibe felt less like a fight club and more like a quilting bee with evidence binders. Karen, for her part, started to fray. She picked public fights in the grocery lot. She lectured the barista about respecting homeowners who built this community, which is rich, considering the field crew working on my hillside built more of this community with their hands than any board meeting ever did. Her big SUV got a parking ticket for sitting in the fire lane while she ranted about my illegal activities to anyone trapped behind her in line. Preston tried one more time to buy me out. He swung by as the sun was going down, beautiful gold bleeding across the rows, gullies glowing like honey. "Final offer," he said. Voice tight. Make this easy. I am, I said. He stared at me, and something mean moved behind his eyes. You have no idea what we can do to you. I do. I didn't say. Because by then, the feds had more recordings than a wedding DJ. The night before the next hearing, we held what can only be described as a war council with snacks. Sarah spread photos across the table, silt in the creek like smoke after a brush burn. Tire tread scars where they shouldn't be. Erosion that made the hillside look like pulled pork. Miguel read statements from workers who'd been told to hurry and forget the paperwork. Ethel outlined the timeline like a school teacher with a good piece of chalk. Tomorrow, Jake said. Let's be boring. Let's be precise. Let the facts do the yelling. The courtroom smelled like old law books and cleaning fluid, the same mix that hung around my first job out of law school. Judge Halvorsen wore patience like a sweater. On the other side, Karen's team had traded their daytime polo shirts for suits, and their Facebook comments for affidavits that sounded brave until you held them up next to statutes. We didn't swing for the fences. We just walked. Steady. Deed language. Heritage designation. Survey lines. Environmental charts. A pattern of harassment, vandalized irrigation. Anonymous calls. Shuffled permits. A map of the HOA payments that wandered into shell companies. The judge didn't lift an eyebrow until Jake said misappropriation. Then he wrote something down with a little more pressure than before. The temporary restraining order against further harassment became less temporary. The court enjoined the HOA from any interference with bona fide agricultural activities within our district. In plain English, Karen had to sit down and hush. I drove back to the farm slow, letting the valley breathe through my open windows. The vines sighed in the evening, like tired men after a long day. I poured a glass of last year's Pinot and sat on the porch with my dog, Duke, who has opinions about squirrels and lawyers. He leaned into my leg like he knew we'd shifted the weight of something huge. Here's the part that surprised me. Winning a round didn't feel like gloating. It felt like stewarding. Like holding a gate that should have always been there. I watched the last light bleed off the hills and thought about my granddad's hands. Big. Square. Nicked all to pieces. Those hands put posts in this ground. Ran lines straight as truth. Lifted baskets full of fruit to the flatbed. On mornings so cold, the coffee steamed like breath. I ain't sentimental by nature. But that night, I toasted the old man and the tough little vines he left me. And the next morning, I got back to work. Harvest doesn't wait for lawsuits. The grapes come on when they come on. And if you miss the window, you bleed money and pride. We picked in the gray hours. Headlamps swinging like slow fireflies. Laughter carried across the rows as the crew ribbed one another about soccer scores and sweethearts. Sarah took soil temps and water readings with the same gentleness she uses on seedlings. Miguel blessed the day in that quiet way he has that doesn't spook the agnostics. In the middle of it all, a white SUV eased to a stop on the lane outside the east fence. Karen. Of course. She rolled down her window and watched us like we were a television show she hated but couldn't turn off. For a long minute, I thought she'd say nothing. Then, you ruined everything. I rested my forearms on the top wire of the fence and let the post hold me up. No. I said. I saved what should have never been threatened. You think people will thank you when their home values fall, when their taxes rise to pay for your hobby, She always called it a hobby when she was trying to be cruel. This land was a family wage long before anybody built a gazebo next to a cul-de-sac. I said, "You moved to wine country and got mad there were grapes." She jerked the wheel like a person who wanted to hit the gas and the past at the same time. Then she drove off, and the lane looked better without her. The state investigation crept like government things do, then pounced like a cat when the file got heavy enough. Notices went out. Depositions were scheduled. A forensics accountant slid through Preston's numbers like a surgeon and came up with arteries that didn't connect to any living heart. The story started to change in the news, in the cafes, in the little Facebook groups that used to host Karen's nightly broadcasts. Words like scheme and fraud and reckless development slid into the mix. The first buyer's suit landed, then another, then a class. Folks who'd signed on the dotted line without a clue. People just trying to raise kids near a nice school. Looked around and realized they'd been sold a bill of goods with a granite countertop. I got emails from them. We didn't know. We were naive. We trusted, and I believed them. Because most people are good. And bad actors count on that goodness to grease the skids. Through it all, the valley grew quieter in the way a place gets quiet when folks start listening again. Deer stepped into the lower pasture at dusk, like they owned it. Which, in a way, they do. Red-tailed hawks rode thermals like old ranchers in rocking chairs. The creek ran less muddy after a soft rain, which told Sarah her remediation plan was working. We were winning more than a case. We were winning back a rhythm. Karen's last stand came not in a courtroom or a meeting, but in a grocery aisle in front of the bulk rice. She cornered me between the dried beans and the peanut butter and hissed, "You think you're the hero?" I wanted to say, "Lady, I think I'm tired." Instead, I said, "I think we're done." Her face did a lot at once: pinched, fell, hardened, broke, patched. "You'll regret this," she whispered, and for just a heartbeat, I saw something human in her fear. Maybe. Or the crumbling of a story she'd told herself for so long it had become a lie she mistook for truth. "I hope," I said gently, "you use this to start over better." She laughed, the kind of laugh you hear from people who can't cry in public. Then she grabbed a family-sized box of pasta off the shelf like she needed to hold something and walked away. The day the verdicts came down, I didn't dress up. I wore work jeans and my cleanest flannel and sat in the back with my hat in my hands. The judge did what judges do, spoke slowly, cited chapter and verse, raised his eyes at a few points to make sure the lesson landed. Preston took it like a man who'd run out of charm and options. Karen took it like a woman who wanted the earth to open. The law did what it's supposed to when people with spines and evidence hold it to its promises. I drove home with the windows down. The valley smelled like cut hay and the first hint of wood smoke from someone up in the higher country. Duke hung his head out like a kid and smiled his dog smile. I pulled into the drive and saw Sarah kneeling by the herb bed. Hands dirty, hair loose, the sun turning her into a painting. I ain't dumb. I know a blessing when I see one. "Good?" she asked, standing. "Right," I said. "Which is better?" I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in the aftermath. Watching a couple of those McMansions get torn down for remediation felt like pulling a splinter you've had for a year. Our Farmers Alliance turned into the Suncrest Heritage Foundation, grants for students, tools for new growers, legal workshops at the Grange Hall, where old-timers told stories, and kids took notes, like they were hearing a creation myth. Miguel convinced the county to set aside a stretch of the hillside as protected land, where wildlife could move like they used to, before culverts and curbs. Sarah got her students out into the rows and taught them to hear the soil when it's thirsty and when it's singing. Ethel wrote a little book about filing cabinets and the people who stuffed them wrong on purpose. It sold more copies than you'd think. Neighbors who'd kept quiet came around with pies and apologies. I took both. Not because I needed pie, though who turns down pie, but because I believe in communities that can change their minds without burning their bridges. Bill from the hardware store asked if we could sponsor the Little League team this year. We said yes and printed our logo on the back of tiny jerseys that will be collected as precious artifacts when those kids have kids. The HOA dissolved itself with more whimper than bang. Karen sold her house and moved 2 counties over. Last I heard, she was doing paperwork for an insurance office in a strip mall near the interstate. I hope she sleeps. I hope. Some quiet afternoon. She sits with a cup of something warm and remembers that enforcing rules ain't the same as building a place worth living in. As for Preston, well, actions. Consequences. The Valley didn't throw a party when the sentence came down. We just planted another row and fixed the gate on the north fence and made dinner for a crew that had worked hard. Here's the truth. I learned the best revenge isn't the headline that makes your enemies wince. It's the life you build in the open after. A vineyard that pays its people fair. A barn lit up for community suppers. A creek running clear because you did the slow, boring work of making it so. We named a new rescue pup Justice, because Duke needed a friend, and I needed the reminder. On summer nights, the dogs chase fireflies between the rows while Sarah and I sit on the porch with our boots off. And the hills hold us like the palm of a kind hand. Sometimes, the wind smells like basil and sun-warmed wood, and that clean, sweet note only a vineyard knows. If you're listening and thinking, that's just a story, let me tell you, no, it's a map. It's a map for anyone whose HOA thinks they outrank your deed. For any family staring down a board with matching polos and a hunger for power. Learn your papers. Talk to your neighbors. Write things down. Get a camera. Find your Ethel. Your Jake. Your Sarah. Your Miguel. The law can be a cudgel. Sure, but in the right hands. It can be a gate latch that keeps the wolves out and the good in. And, don't forget to breathe. Even warriors gotta sleep. So tell me, what would you do if your HOA tried to strangle a piece of living history on your street? Have they fined you for the color of your mailbox? The height of your grass? At the truck in your driveway? Drop your story in the comments where you're watching from. What you've seen. Who stood up when it counted. Anyone else had a HOA do this to you? Because when we pool our stories, we build a wall higher than any fence Karen ever waved a clipboard at. And that kind of wall, it lets light through, keeps neighbors close, and still says, clear as a bell, this land has a memory, and it ain't for sale.